You think the FDA exists because the government cares about you. Wrong. It exists because one guy wrote a book so gross it made the president throw up his breakfast. Picture this. It's a spring morning in 1906. Theodore Roosevelt, the 26th President of the United States, a man who charged up San Juan Hill, a man who hunted grizzly bears for fun, is sitting in the White House eating breakfast. He's got his sausages. He's got his eggs. He's got a brand new book in his hands. He's reading a novel called The Jungle. And according to the legend, a story that got so famous, a popular humorist of the time wrote a whole bit about it. Teddy gets about halfway through his breakfast and halfway through the book. He reads one particular passage. And then, the man who stared down, charging bull moose, does something he's never done before. He screams. Our Teddy was toying with a light breakfast and idly turning over the pages of the new book with both hands, the humorist Finley Peter Dunne wrote, imagining the scene. Suddenly he rose from the table and crying, "I'm Pizen," began throwing sausages out of the window. Did Roosevelt literally hurl his breakfast meat out the window of the White House? Probably not. But the story spread because it captured something true. This book was so viscerally disgusting that it made the most macho president in American history lose his appetite. So what did he read? So what was in this book that made the president lose his mind? The Jungle is set in a real place, Chicago, 1905, a neighborhood called Packingtown. This was the heart of America's meatpacking industry, a sprawling complex of stockyards and slaughterhouses where most of the country's meat was processed. And the book describes what happened inside those walls in nauseating detail. According to the book, you could smell Packingtown before you could see it. The stench, a mixture of decaying blood, rotting tissue, fertilizer dust, and smoke, hung over the neighborhood like a fog. 2 million visitors toured the stockyards every year, marveling at the industrial efficiency. But the book takes you into the back rooms, the places visitors never saw. The book describes factories operating around the clock, mountains of meat sitting in storage rooms where the roofs leaked and water dripped down over everything. The rooms were dark, too dark to see what you were touching. And in that darkness, the book says, thousands of rats scurried over the piles of meat. Workers could run their hands across these mountains of flesh and sweep off handfuls of dried rat droppings. The packers, the book explains, put out poisoned bread to kill the rats. But when the rats died, nobody bothered to pick them out. The dead rats, the poisoned bread, and the meat all went into the same hoppers together. All of it got ground up into sausage. The man doing the shoveling wouldn't even stop to lift out a rat when he saw one. The book claims there were worse things going into that sausage than rats. And that's not even close to the worst part. The book describes meat that had fallen on the floor, into the dirt and sawdust, where workers had walked and spit uncounted billions of tuberculosis germs, getting scooped up and processed anyway. Many of these workers were sick. They coughed blood onto the processing lines. They had no place to wash their hands before eating lunch, so they washed them in the water that was going to be ladled into the sausage. The book goes on, old spoiled meat treated with chemicals to cover the smell. Moldy sausage rejected and sent back from Europe, dosed with borax and glycerin, dumped back into the hoppers, and sold to American consumers as fresh. There was never the least attention paid to what got cut up for sausage. Rotten beef doctored with chemicals until you couldn't tell it had ever gone bad. Pork fat and beef scraps canned and labeled as potted chicken. No chicken in it, barely anything identifiable in it. Old rancid butter bought up from grocery stores across the continent, chemically treated to remove the smell, rechurned with skim milk and sold as fresh. But here's the passage that made Roosevelt scream, the one that turned America's stomach, the one that people still talk about over 100 years later. The book describes workers in the cooking rooms laboring in tank rooms full of steam, where there were open vats of boiling lard near the level of the floor. The steam was so thick you could barely see. The floors were slick, and sometimes, workers fell into those vats. The book puts it like this: when they were fished out, there was never enough of them left to be worth exhibiting. Sometimes they would be overlooked for days, till all but the bones of them had gone out to the world as Durham's pure leaf lard. Human beings, cooked, overlooked for days, sold as cooking fat. That's what was written in this book. And once people read it, every time someone bought a can of lard, they wondered, is there a person in here? When this book hit the shelves in February 1906, America lost its collective mind. Within 6 weeks, it had sold 25,000 copies. It was translated into 17 languages within months. It became an international sensation. Front page news not just in America, but in London, Paris, Berlin. And the panic was immediate and total. Meat sales across the country plummeted overnight. Butcher shops that had been packed with customers suddenly stood empty. Restaurants couldn't give away sausages. Hotels stopped serving pork. Families who had eaten canned beef for years threw out their entire pantries. Germany and France banned American meat products entirely. British imports of American canned meat stopped overnight, and the international reputation of American food collapsed so fast that diplomats got involved. The meatpacking industry lost millions of dollars in weeks. People weren't just disgusted, they were terrified. They'd been eating this stuff for years. Their children had been eating this stuff for years. Their elderly parents, their pregnant wives. How many rat droppings had they consumed? How much tuberculosis spit? How many people? The human lard story spread like wildfire. Newspapers ran it on the front page. Preachers mentioned it in sermons. People whispered about it at dinner parties, then couldn't finish their dinners. The phrase, Durham's pure leaf lard, became a sick joke. Every can of cooking fat in every kitchen suddenly looked suspicious. One famous satirist wrote that, after reading the book, even President Roosevelt became a vegetarian. And here's the darkest irony of the whole thing. Everyone was horrified about what might be in their food. Everyone was terrified they might have accidentally committed cannibalism. But nobody, not one person, stopped to ask, what happened to that man's family? The one who fell in the vat? What happened to his wife, his children, when he didn't come home from work? Did the company pay them anything? Did anyone even tell them how he died? No, of course not. Because that wasn't the story America cared about. They cared about the food. They cared about their stomachs. They cared about themselves. The workers who fell into those vats, they were just an unpleasant ingredient. Now, before I tell you who actually wrote this book, and trust me, that's where this story goes from crazy to absolutely insane. If you're the kind of person who likes stories where history is way weirder than you thought, do me a favor, subscribe, hit the bell. Because we do this every week, and the next one is just as unhinged. Alright, back to it. Now let me tell you about the man who wrote this book, because this is where the story gets really interesting. Here's the thing nobody remembers. The Jungle was not supposed to be about food safety, not even a little bit. The author wasn't a journalist investigating the meat industry. He wasn't a health inspector. He wasn't a scientist or a doctor or a government official. He was a 26-year-old broke socialist named Upton Sinclair, and he was on a mission. Sinclair didn't care about what was in your sausage. He didn't care about food safety or public health. He cared about the workers, the poor, mostly immigrant laborers who toiled in those hellish factories for pennies an hour. He believed capitalism was grinding human beings into dust, and he wanted to expose it so brutally that America would rise up and demand socialism. A socialist newspaper gave him $500 and sent him to Chicago to investigate. Not the meat, the workers, the human suffering. When Sinclair arrived at his Chicago hotel, he reportedly announced to anyone who would listen, "I am Upton Sinclair, and I have come to write the Uncle Tom's Cabin of the labor movement." For 7 weeks, he went undercover. He dressed in grimy clothes, carried a worker's lunch pail, and snuck into the factories. He talked to workers. He watched men lose fingers to machinery. He saw families destroyed by poverty and exhaustion. He witnessed the systematic crushing of the human spirit. And then he went home and spent 9 months writing a novel about it. The book follows a Lithuanian immigrant named Jurgis Rudkus, who arrives in America full of hope. He gets a job in the meatpacking plants. And then, over 300 pages, capitalism systematically destroys everything he has. His health, his savings, his home. His wife dies in childbirth. His child drowns in the mud of a Chicago street. He becomes a drunk, a criminal, a vagrant. The book ends with Jurgis finding salvation in socialism. The final pages are basically a political manifesto. The last words are a socialist orator crying out, "Chicago will be ours! Chicago will be ours!" That was supposed to be the point, the suffering of the workers, and then the promise of revolution. But Sinclair had made one mistake. He'd included all that stuff about the meat, the rats, the poison, the human lard. He thought it was just background detail, a way to show how terrible the working conditions were. He had no idea it would become the only thing anyone remembered. When the book became a bestseller, Sinclair waited for the revolution. He'd exposed capitalism in all its horror. Surely Americans would demand change. They demanded change, all right. They demanded to know if there were rats in their breakfast. People would come up to him at events and ask about the lard vats. He would try to redirect to labor rights, to the plight of the working class. They would ask about the rats again. He gave interviews about socialism and got questions about sausage. He wrote follow-up articles about worker exploitation and got letters about food contamination. He watched his book spark a national conversation about everything except what he'd wanted to talk about. The man had written a socialist manifesto disguised as a novel, and all anyone could see was the disguise. President Roosevelt had to act. Not because he cared about workers, he actually called Sinclair a crackpot because of his socialist beliefs. But the public was in a frenzy. Meat sales were cratering. Something had to be done. Roosevelt sent investigators to Chicago. The meat packers found out in advance and spent 3 weeks scrubbing their plants clean. It didn't matter. The investigators were still appalled. They confirmed almost everything in the book, except the human lard, which nobody could prove. On June 30th, 1906, Roosevelt signed 2 landmark pieces of legislation, the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. These laws created federal food safety standards and established what would eventually become the FDA. Victory, right? The system worked, right? Here's the final twist. The big meatpacking companies, the ones Sinclair had tried to expose, they actually supported the legislation. They lobbied for it because they realized something clever. These new regulations would cost money. Inspectors would need to be paid. Facilities would need to be upgraded. Small independent butchers couldn't afford to comply. But the giant corporations, they could absorb those costs easily. The big packers got taxpayers to foot the bill for inspections, about $3 million a year. And the new regulations crushed their smaller competitors who couldn't keep up. Sinclair saw this coming. He actually opposed the laws he'd accidentally helped create. He called them an unjustified boon to large meat packers. Nobody listened. And the workers, the immigrants Sinclair had gone undercover to help. The people whose suffering was supposed to be the whole point, their lives didn't change. The new laws made food safer for consumers, but did absolutely nothing for labor conditions. Workers still toiled in dangerous, freezing, blood-soaked jobs for poverty wages. They still lost fingers. They still got sick. They still fell into vats. 100 years later, in 2005, Human Rights Watch released a report on the American meatpacking industry titled Blood, Sweat, and Fear. It documented systematic human rights violations, unsafe conditions, and exploitation of immigrant labor. Some things never change. Upton Sinclair lived to be 90 years old. He wrote more than 90 books. He won a Pulitzer Prize. He ran for governor of California. He became one of the most prolific American authors of the 20th century. But nothing he ever wrote matched the impact of The Jungle. And he spent his entire life knowing that impact was completely, utterly, spectacularly wrong. He summed up his failure with one perfect sentence. Maybe the most perfect sentence ever written about unintended consequences. I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident, I hit it in the stomach. He wanted Americans to feel outrage for their fellow human beings. They felt nausea about their breakfast. And here's the thing that haunts me. Every time you pick up a package of ground beef and see that little USDA inspected stamp, you're looking at Upton Sinclair's legacy. Every nutrition label, every FDA approval, every food recall. All of it exists because a socialist tried to start a revolution and accidentally made people worry about rat droppings in their sausage. Every FDA stamp is a monument to his failure. Every ingredient label is a tombstone for his revolution. We remember the book that changed America. We just remember it for all the wrong reasons. We got safe sausages. We missed the point entirely. Upton Sinclair wanted you to care about people. You cared about rats. But hey, at least there probably aren't any rats in your sausage anymore. Probably. Sleep tight.